everybody. Hello again. Warm welcome from us here at the Institute of Contemporary History. We are going to hear a new lecture in the series of events, History on the Edge. And our guest lecturer is Nergis Canefe. She is coming from York University in Canada, and she will be giving a presentation titled Histories of Belonging in the Global East. Now, Professor Canefe is a professor of politics, public policy, and law at York University in Canada. She holds a double degree, double PhD in public international law and social and political thought. Academically trained in the history of social and political thought and the history of international law. Her areas of interest are memories of atrocities and injustices and how these shape notions of citizenship for marginalized groups. This particular lecture will be related to the differences between constitutional regimes of citizenships under Soviet influence and the EU framework on citizenship. In the course of the lecture, she will present a more concrete case study from Hungary, the Czech Republic, and Slovenia. From this point on, Nergis has the word. Thank you very much for coming, and I will come back for the questions.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. Can you actually hear me? Sorry, I lost my voice trying to walk around Slovenia while it was raining. Not well prepared. So today's lecture is a continuation of work that I started last year, whereby I spent 2 months at the Open Society Archives, the Archivum, looking at the displacement of Hungarian and Czech refugees after the political upheavals and the revolutions, namely of 1956 and 68. And my visit at the Institute is a continuation of some of the questions that remain with me in terms of the negotiation of the imperial, then Soviet, then EU influences in refugee regimes concerning Central Europe. So some of the findings I'm actually very happy with, and others are still work in progress, and I don't know how to manage this. So is this what I use? I guess, no? How do I go to the next one? I'm sorry. Yeah, I tried that. Oh, okay. So where did you touch? On this side. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Right. So I just wanted to mention that being here, I also wanted to connect with colleagues who are completing their Borders projects and perhaps other debates at the Institute of Contemporary History, including projects on fascism and new forms of populism, because what I have to say really relate to those as well. I mean, the Borders project actually outlines as one of its aims the overcoming of the nationalistic, anachronistic, and deterministic outlooks and a better understanding of the complex processes of boundaries. And I'm hoping that by highlighting some of the traditions in Central Europe concerning refugees and integration and welcoming practices, it may be possible to fast forward to today and perhaps reframe current discussions. And the Borders project also talks about phantom borders, which is a very, very important concept concerning Central Europe and the changing border practices. And my interest is statelessness in Europe as a historical concept, and that has to be contextualized depending on the era. And I particularly concentrate on exile, return, and no right of return of exilic communities, which leads to exilic loss and other conundrums of nation-building projects in Central Europe. And eventually, I think what this work amounts to and then joins the conversation of is the reimagining of Central, Eastern, and Southeastern Europe above and beyond methodological nationalisms. And I'm going to manage to move this again. No? This way. Okay. So Slovenia is a sanctuary. I'm going to start with that debate, and I'm going to go backwards all the way to a pre-World War I Czechoslovakia, and then come back in full circle. And I think I must have enough time because I timed my slides accordingly. So the 2015-16 refugee crisis emanating from the Middle East and North Africa, otherwise known as the Arab Spring, exacerbated the situation that already engulfed refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers in Europe. As you all know, the numbers excessed several millions, the majority of whom are currently settled primarily in Germany because of the leftover policy measures that Germany inherited from the Second World War. And in March 2016, immediately after the official closure of the humanitarian corridor along the Balkan route, and then that corridor either emanated from Turkey but also from Russia and the Mediterranean Aegean sea crossings, that led to basically the transfer of almost 1 million people from Greece towards Central and North Europe. And EU had to reinforce its policy of closed borders and started externalization of migration control. That was almost 8 years ago, and the problem today continues, not to the extent that it was back in 2016, but because of the turmoil in the Middle East have not subsided. You now have the additional chapter of the post-October 7th Israeli war on Palestinians. So likely the Balkan corridor, albeit clandestinely, will continue to offer some sort of a solution for the overspilling of refugees in Middle East and North Africa. However, the cumulative effect of the disruption of the European border regime by the events of 2011 onwards also led to the fragmentation of the EU, with an intensification of the division between South, North, East, and West. What I mean is some countries had rather liberal asylum policies, whereas others, including the Visegrad countries, I call them, in Central Europe, became increasingly tense and very anxious about the arrival of large groups of refugees. And we do know from my EU colleagues who work on forced migration that the EU failed to envision and implement a common response to the crisis, and the burden was unevenly distributed among the countries. And there was a lack of solidarity among member states, which also led to an unprecedented rise of far-right and anti-EU parties in national parliaments following the influx of refugees in Central and Eastern Europe. So you also see changes in the Schengen Agreement that actually relate to these pressures. And what we ultimately see is the normalization of states of emergency across several borders, which was heightened by the COVID-19 crisis ongoing as of early 2020. Basically, the measures such as border closures, restrictions on freedom of movement, curfews, population tracking, and severe limitations to the right of social, political, and economic participation have become fairly routine practices in terms of border management. So one of the aims of my study is to analyze the citizenship and integration policies and practices in Slovenia, but in tandem with Hungary and Czechoslovakia, because there is a very rich history of anti-racist border struggles in Slovenia, such as the movements of Bosnian refugees, the so-called erased migrant workers and asylum seekers. And it has not been a done deal in any of these movements, and there has been societal pushbacks in terms of the integration of these groups. These forced migration movements eliminate and challenge the myth of border control and selective citizenship appropriation in a formally united political space in post-Yugoslav Slovenia. So that's the kind of history that I will briefly share with you, and I apologize for repetitions because many of you might be very familiar with what I'm talking about, but for me this is relatively novel territory. So the migrant population in Slovenia continues to rise, leading to the emergence of a steady population of both regular and irregular migrants, asylum seekers, and persons with international protection status or without. These are the stateless ones. their survival strategies lead to features of citizenship that are exercised by people who do not have any formal legal status. And then again, there's a very rich EU literature on access to rights and participation without citizenship status. However, I think in the Slovenian literature, that kind of debate is relatively new. And it's kind of presented as a dichotomy between whether you have citizenship or you don't have citizenship. And what I want to show is also in the examples of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, with multiple forced migration movements, that dichotomy was not applicable. There were actually very large populations that existed in these geographies without necessarily the extension of citizenship, sometimes for generations. And it seems to be not necessarily an aberration of the national policies. So let's just go. Historical tensions. And by the way, the images that I use are actually my own drawings, so I don't have a copyright issue. And I was saying to the center people that at some future date, if you want murals, I'm a mural painter. Most of these are very giant paintings. I'm happy to paint your walls, so it's just a side. So the historical tensions in Central Europe seems to be citizenship is in the core. Then you've got the stateless as far as either arriving without a status or basically somehow being exiled. And in the third circle, I put belonging because some of these people who do not have citizenship or might be in a limbo position also have significant questions of belonging. And finally, the exilic communities, when you look at the Hungarian and Czech examples, emigrating from Hungary and Czechoslovakia, former Czechoslovakia, and then also at the moment, since the post-independence Slovenia, seem to not return. So they're like at the very outset. And some of them are included in diaspora studies, but for the most part, when the nation spits these populations out, often there's no return for them. And the ones who are coming in as refugees and asylum seekers are not necessarily the ones who are returning, who were once exiled. And a typical example of that is basically the ethnic German populations in Central Europe, as well as Jewish populations. And to a degree, if you go further north, the Russian ethnic groups, who once had citizenship, then became stateless, then their belonging was questioned, and then eventually they were exiled, never to return. So that seems to be, in terms of emigration, the profile of Central Europe and the Visegrad countries. I'm going to try again. So the forgotten peoples of Slovenia, and then I use that term because they're also forgotten peoples of Hungary and Czechoslovakia, or former Czechoslovakia rather, which are people who once had citizenship, who once belonged to the polity, but during different stages of state formation and nationality building, they were either forced to leave or they became exilic. And in national histories, they are no longer mentioned, despite the fact that some of them have generations of coexistence in a Visegrad landscape. So, asylum to Slovenia, legal and policy framework. The asylum and the migration legislation in Slovenia is obviously an emergent and growing field of study. Since Slovenia entered the EU in 2004, we see the harmonization of the European Union law, which led to fast-paced legislative activities, which is quite normal. And before 1999, Slovenia did not have proper asylum legislation in place. This is what I'm learning from different immigration experts. Apart from a general position on refugees, including the Alien Legislation Act. I must say that this is not unusual. Most of the time, when you look at the signatories to the Refugee Convention, they're primarily the victors of the Second World War to a certain degree and a certain cluster of states. And most of the global south and the majority of the states in the global east are now signatories to the Refugee Convention, which means that often they cover issues of refugees, statelessness, citizenship attribution through either Alien Legislation Act or some constitutional provisions. So this is very common. And EU does not like that. They would like to have an even terrain, and therefore Slovenia actually saw the first Comprehensive Asylum Act in 1999, which had 4 amendments. In 2007, I actually went through these acts, which were quite interesting. This act was replaced by the International Protection Act, which is basically providing synchronization of Slovenian policy with international mandates. That also went through amendments, and finally in 2016, the act was replaced by the International Protection Act that, as far as I know, is currently in force. If you look at these dates, interestingly, surrounding countries also went through similar reiterations of their Protection Act, because I think it became quite obvious that the refugee flows were not a one-time off, and they will continue. So they had to come up with strategic solutions in terms of screening, acceptance, integration, and most of the regimes in the region currently opt for what's called temporary protection status, which is, for some international refugee law scholars, a deviation from the spirit of the Refugee Convention. Yet, looking at the numbers arriving, especially in smaller countries like Slovenia, to embrace the Refugee Convention in the letter of the convention would practically be impossible, because if you're talking about a country of 2 million, as far as I know, since 2015, 500,000 asylum seekers went through or tried to stay in Slovenia. So that's about 25% of the population. So attribution of citizenship would have been very, very difficult, and that's why these new international protection acts primarily prioritize temporary protection regimes, hoping that in the next decade or so, the asylum seekers will eventually return to their homelands. So, and the army comes to town. As I said, approximately 500,000 refugees and migrants passed through Slovenian territory between September 2015 and March 2016. That number is no longer so excessive, but obviously extraordinary times required extraordinary measures. And so we saw creation of a crisis that required both governmental and non-governmental institutions to get involved. And we also saw the Slovenian armed forces being included in this process as support for civil protection and police. And the military's role followed the military mission defined by the Defense Act. For those of you who are interested in constitutional maneuvers, these are very interesting emergency decrees. Why do I mention that? Because for Slovenians, this might be a moment of necessity and honor, but in the international fora, not the Slovenian army, but the Hungarian army and police have been portrayed under a very bad light, dragging refugees by their hair, kicking them, and they were almost presented as militarization of asylum and direct attacks on asylum seekers and forcefully separating women from their children and whatnot. So the involvement or the army has been an interesting parenthesis in terms of the refugee crisis. So let's just go back. Let's just summarize the background for the Slovenian citizenship regime. So when Slovenia became a sovereign state, obviously it had to redefine who its citizens were. Were all residents of Slovenia, regardless of their ethnic and religious belonging, to be treated equally? That's a prime question, also for Hungarians and Czech and Slovak nationalists. And certain parts of the secession legislation basically led to a limited designation of citizenry and the erasure from the register of permanent residents, which kind of led to an ethnic-civic dichotomy, which is quite common in post-Soviet republics and nation-states. And I suggest that Slovenian nationalism thus can be presented in 3 distinct phases, which is the counter-state nationalism. Before the breakup of Yugoslavia, you're targeting the Yugoslav state-building nationalism, and the initial designation of citizenry, which basically allowed for non-ethnic Slovenes to be registered for the first 6 months, and that's a very common practice that we also see in Baltic republics. and the nationalizing state after the secession, which is marked by erasure and revoking of citizenship status of sometimes naturalized citizens, as well as difficulties that are imposed on refugees and asylum seekers concerning having access to citizenship. So in these three phases, we see very different state practices. Interestingly, Slovenia's national minorities, Italian, Hungarian, Roma communities, the Germans were already gotten rid of, did not play a direct role in Slovenian independence process. But they also represent less than 2% of the population, and they don't pose a threat. Whereas other immigrant communities arriving, as well as minorities from former Yugoslavia, were constituting approximately 10% of the population, which is a very sizable population, and there's kin nationalism fears, etc. So their treatment has been quite different. So I say 50 Shades of Citizenship, and then I know perhaps the reference is not so nice in terms of different degrees of access to social and political rights, but also different perceptions of whether you belong or not to Slovenia. Basically, when you look at the erasure, the erased communities eventually challenged the boundaries of Slovene citizenship. The exclusion in the form of erasure from registers of permanent residence in Slovenia back in 1992 actually extended beyond the creation of foreigners within the country with the right to remain and support themselves. The literature indicates that many of them lost even their housing rights and driving licenses, and they had no place else to go. And the principle of jus sanguini, which basically bracketed Slovenianness as a primary category, and then therefore ethnicized citizenship, was not upfront challenged until much later, whereby the highest constitutional court declared the erased and then the policy measures leading to the erasure as unconstitutional. We are talking about close to 20,000 people, so it's not a very large community, but these kinds of acts tend to indicate the potential possibilities in state practices in terms of citizenship. So I'm inching towards Czechoslovakian, former Czechoslovakian and Hungarian examples. Majoritarian identity formation is very, very common in the region, post-Soviet departures, and it kind of presents a contrast to the multinational polity and multi-ethnic forms of belonging prior to the independence. And the Soviet model was also quite clearly pronouncing ethnicities and minorities, albeit it was also engaging in forced resettlement of many of the groups that it declared as dangerous citizens. But compared to the Soviet past or the Yugoslav past, when you look at this redefinition of citizenship in the post-independence Slovenia, it is true that, for instance, it accepted forced migrations from Bosnia-Herzegovina. It has also been very open to, historically very open to Czech and Slovak migrants and refugees running away from the oppressive regime throughout the 1970s and early 1980s. It became a route. And it has also been very open in terms of accepting refugees and asylum seekers from the Balkans. Nonetheless, it seems like the emphasis about Slovenianness has become squarely focused on ethnic Slovenianness and roots to the land and jus sanguini. I think I should be able to do this. So who belongs? This is a really, really important question. And I just need to put a parenthesis about Global East. Global East is a derivation from the debates on the Global South. Otherwise, I'm known as a 12th scholar, which is basically 12 law approaches the international law, which looks at different applications and impositions of international law in the post-colonial world. And for the last 5 years, increasing number of scholars have been coming together to appropriate some of the methodologies we use to look at post-Soviet realities and how both the EU directives and international narratives have been reshaping the Central and Eastern European nation states and their policy and practices. So after my residence here, I'll be spending 2.5 months in Germany working with a group who are from Poland and Ukraine and Hungary and other Eastern and Central European countries. We are trying to redefine the global East that could actually become a methodology in terms of looking at these national formations as well as immigration and forced migration movements and citizenship practices. So that's why I use the term Global East. It's an emergent term. It's not widely accepted, but I think there's a movement towards legitimizing it so that the only point of comparison for Central and Eastern Europe is not EU, but there's an acknowledgement of past realities, both the three imperial structures being the Russian, the Habsburg, and the Ottoman, as well as the Soviet influences in terms of citizenship regimes and state practices. So within that larger context, who belongs is a very interesting question, because that question has different answers during the Soviet influence period and Yugoslav period as opposed to post-Soviet, post-Yugoslav period. Existing practices of preferential treatment for members of the dominant nation seems to be not so pronounced in the pre-independence periods, which is a curiosity, because the moment of independence, at least ideally, leads towards a more liberal understanding of the polity and membership, and yet in practice it seems to ethnicize the definition of the national polity. So maybe some of the remembering practices might be helpful in terms of reshaping this discourse. Back to the future. Slovenians' place in Mittel Europa as a place of social care, I argue, is complicated by certain historical conditions that render it a transitory space between the other and the real Europe, meaning Middle East, meaning parts of the former Russian Soviet domain, and the post-socialist transition and the neoliberal intent of its national infrastructure created excesses of state power in terms of distribution of citizenship. So the issue about non-ethnic Slovenes, as well as the intake of non-European asylum seekers as per European refugee policies, indicate the primacy of an ethnocultural conception of membership, despite the embeddedness of the Slovenian citizenship regime within international and supranational frameworks. I mean, this is a debate that I'd like to work on while I'm here, so these are preliminary statements that I'm making, and I'm very open to criticism, and if you want to take them apart, I'll be more than happy, and that's why I'm here. But the other part is basically the post-imperial realities, and we're going to start with Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and I'm looking at the time, and I think I'm still doing okay. So Arendt at the time, who also wrote about the Hungarian Revolution, declared after the Second World War that citizenship is the right to have rights. That motto has been widely challenged by citizenship scholarship, transnationalism scholarship, diaspora scholarship, and yet it continues to be the claim that citizenship in the context of Soviet-era Central Europe really holds a very, very important place in terms of membership to the polity. So we see two political models whereby the legal subject or the political subject is situated in opposition to the citizen, and that model applies to refugees from Hungarian and former Czechoslovak revolutions, whereby the political subject that was actually taking a stance against the Soviet regime and its brethren was no longer recognized as a citizen, and then their passports were basically nullified, and it took about 2 generations for these people's offsprings even to come back with the condition that there was no return of land and property. And this is something that I learned in detail during my stay in Hungary, whereby even the people who were working at the Open Society archives, some of them were children of these people who left in 1956 and could not come back, and then their own passports were derivative passports, and then they could never have access to the family's properties or belongings prior to the exit. So this opposition of political subject, citizen, basically weaponizes citizenry, and it gets rid of people's citizenry the moment they actually start posing a challenge to the regime. And then the more normative, more contemporary opposition is citizen versus the alien and stateless. And then that's the contemporary refugee regime. So you've got people coming from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from Syria, from Tunisia, you name it. And they enter as aliens, and they have temporary protection status, and some of them are actually stateless because they have no documents and or the state does not recognize them where they were born. And so they have this kind of fluid existence without citizenship. But for all intents and purposes, they are not considered as full members of the polity. So therefore, they're kind of, there's an opposition in the second case. And I love Gogol's The Dead Souls. The context is different, obviously, because Gogol is talking about the dead serfs as the landowner's property, but he's also talking about the moral decomposition of the society. I mean, many scholars, I'm going to manage this, argue that this kind of opposition of citizens versus aliens, citizens versus temporary protection status people who might live amidst Central European societies for a generation or two, sometimes lead to what's called social debt and civic debt, because you're never a fully part of the discussion and the decision-making processes. And I think I made a mistake. Okay, let's try again. So, going back to post-imperial realities, the will of the people indicated that post-Soviet states recognized only nationals who are mostly ethnically defined as citizens, and it grants full civil and political rights only to those who belong to the national community by right of origin and the fact of birth. That's jus sanguinis. And fundamental rights and the legal capacity to be recognized as a person therefore becomes very dependent on status civitatis, which is different than status personae, which means you have inalienable rights as a person, regardless of your citizenship status. And then maybe, I'm thinking in Central Europe, this is where the debate should be inching towards, and the recognition of status personae as a category valid in and of itself, as opposed to people waiting for citizenship acquisition to become recognized as member of the polity and enter the belonging narrative. So the price of the revolutions, I'm going to summarize in the interest of the time. It looks like when you look at forced population movements, both from Hungary and Czechoslovakia, ethnicity and religion became markers mostly for removal. But political standing became a target for Soviet-inclined governments for you to be exiled. But it also became a marker for you to be accepted by surrounding countries and to be welcome, so that the front against the Soviet regime could be fortified. No such welcome was extended to ethnic Germans. No such welcome was extended to Central and Eastern European Jews. In fact, we see in the case of both Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the states actively recognized the state of Israel and also arranged for the transfer of the Jewish populations from the Central and Eastern Europe, despite the fact that they had full citizenship in these polities. But they were quite happy to accept each other's political refugees, with the hope that eventually the Soviet regime would come down. So it looks like the threshold for acceptance was pretty low when you were running away from oppressive regime, be it the Nazi Germany, be it the Soviet satellite regimes. But the threshold of acceptance was very high if you're arriving in relation to an ethnically and religiously marked community. Perhaps the only exception might be the Bosnia-Herzegovina and the refugees running away from the Yugoslav wars there to Slovenia. But the Hungarian and Czech regimes, Czechoslovak regimes at the time, did not open their borders to refugees from Bosnia-Herzegovina because they did not have a vested interest in the sustenance and survival of these groups. And these groups did not necessarily promise a political, how shall we say, added value if they were included in the polity. So I know what I'm saying is not necessarily uplifting, but we also see in terms of commemorations, every nation looks back and commemorates certain things. And for instance, we see that, interestingly, in 2015, there was a huge commemoration wave in Hungary of the 1956 events and the refugees, enormous amounts of money, and there were like 1,430 events that commemorated the 1956 revolution. What was missing in those commemorations were many of the 200,000 people who fled the country, meaning Hungary at the time, and the majority of them settled either in Austria or former Yugoslavia. They did not return. And only the child soldiers, at the behest of their families, the boy soldiers, returned en masse. Some of them basically tried to return, but they were interrogated so heavily they ran away again. And they never made a peace with the regime until the date of independence. And they were never embraced by the society so fully either. And they had relatively insufferable experiences in the West. They weren't put on a pedestal in Austria. They became part of the labor force in Switzerland. They were really trying to adapt. And the more they became laborers as opposed to political asylum seekers, the more their national identity basically evaporated, and the memory of them as the heroes of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution is non-existent in Hungary. So, which is very interesting. The event is celebrated, but the refugees themselves, they're not mentioned, debated. But there's also the accumulation by dispossession part of it, whereby the 200,000 who fled, majority of them were middle class, upper middle class, and their properties were compensated by the state and redistributed, and then they were never returned. So there's that aspect of that as well, which makes commemoration quite difficult. So the general amnesty for quasi-citizenship, we actually look at, I'm going to go to 1957, whereby Hungary proclaimed amnesty, established a Hungarian-Yugoslav Joint Committee, as well as a repatriation office in Vienna. So again, we're now moving towards the Slovene realities and former Yugoslav realities in Hungary, and the kind of, how shall we say, intertwined histories. And Hungarians were trying to get the 1956 refugees back, so that they can claim to the Hungarian society that life in Hungary was much better than what they've seen elsewhere. And this was not a successful arrangement, but nonetheless, they issued consular passports, they issued other kinds of documentation to make sure that one-way return is possible. And what we know from the Yugoslav experience is that the Hungarians who were expatriated, majority of them did not return, and some of them actually nationalized in former Yugoslavia. So tales to be told. There's more about the Hungarians. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm happy to share the PowerPoint and the article that I'm working on once it's ready for the public eye. let's talk about state practices of neglect. Because neglect is a very interesting category. There are two kinds of hurt that the state can cause and engage in a failure of the duty of care. One is by commission, and the other is by omission. So neglect is a very interesting category of state action, whereby things are happening, you know about it, you are actually under obligation to do something about it, you may have the capability to do something about it, but you choose to neglect it. And that leads to a very different form of political violence. So what we see is, both in the situation of 1956 Hungarian refugees, but later on, in the case of former Czechoslovakia, the Hungarian and Czechoslovak states feigned neglect. And they basically turned a blind eye to the suffering of the refugees, the inability for them to establish themselves, the consular passports and whatnot. They became somehow functional in many years, sometimes a decade, sometimes 2 decades later. And the lives of these people, at least in the Hungarian case, which is quite a large number, they were basically discarded. That's the term that's used, and new forms of vulnerabilities emerged. What's interesting is Europe then and Europe now, as a stark contrast to the Hungarian and Czechoslovak states, former Czechoslovak states' neglect, what we see is the formation of the Intergovernmental Committee for European Migration, otherwise known as ICEM, and that's the origins of International Organization of Migration, IOM, today, which is the biggest organization in the world concerning the management of forced migration. We also see other European synergies emerging for the reception of Hungarian and former Czechoslovak political refugees in different parts of Europe, their settlement, the regularization of their documents, their retraining for the job market. So very, very organized, I would say, operation of taking them in. And the consensus about that is this was a Cold War affair. So if it wasn't for the Cold War and it wasn't for Europe really being hungry for qualified labor power, maybe the Hungarian and former Czechoslovak refugees would not have been received with such open arms, and then maybe you wouldn't have this organizational, institutional response to it. But I'm not so sure, because when you look at Czechoslovak history, you see that the Czechoslovak state, former Czechoslovak state, was very active in settling Russian immigrants after the Bolshevik Revolution. They were also very, very involved in resettling the communists that are targeted by their families by the Greek dictatorship. So they settled those as well. So these organizational settlements based on the political premium that these refugees offer seem to be quite widespread in Central Europe, in the Visegrad landscape. So to sum it all up, it looks like there is a distinction to be made between political versus non-political refugees and repatriation options. So this is how it looks like. I know I'm simplifying it, but oh gosh, this is not here. All right. So if you're of mixed heritage, if you belong to an ethnic group, that's not a majority. If you belong to an ethno-religious group that is seen as potentially suspect, like the Jews of Central and Eastern Europe, if you belong to societies that are not considered as European, if you belong to the elite of regimes who were very suppressive in their operations, like the Russian ethnic groups in Baltic states, independent, post-independent Baltic states, your chances of being offered citizenship, your chances of being offered asylum are relatively minimal compared to if you actually carry a premium in terms of political alliances for the Visegrad regimes, if you somehow establish human capital for them, and if you somehow indicate that you are willing to somehow settle in the community and become part of the community with the option that you really indeed eventually hope to repatriate. Those groups have been most welcome and most readily incorporated into the system, and some of them have been given citizenship or they have been naturalized, as opposed to the first group, which already come with markers of ethno-religious distinction, which do not necessarily pay allegiance to the regime, communist, post-Soviet, whichever type it may be. And then they have a much higher likelihood of actually being integrated into the society. And they do enhance the sense of belonging of the majoritarian nation. So reversing of the tide, this is a subheading that looks at the Czechoslovak reception of Polish, Italian, and Jewish refugees, as well as German refugees. This is of interest to my historian colleagues because initially during the 1930s, after the First World War, the former Czechoslovak state was very open to accepting these groups and settling them. But as we inch towards the Nazi hegemony, we actually see the division of these groups into ethnic cul-de-sacs and then ghettoization, and some of them never saw the light of the day again as a result of this ghettoization of refugee camps. So you see the tide being open, and then the tide being very ethno-nationalized, and then the tide being again open in the case of Greek refugees, and the tide being again closed in the case of refugees from the Middle East. So there isn't a linear trajectory, so to speak. The balancing act on refugees, this is very, very important for Slovenia, for Hungary, and for the current Czech and Slovak republics. The larger the number, the less likely that they're actually going to be included, because these are relatively small populations. The home nation is relatively small in size. And despite the histories of care and the histories of political ties, it's quite common that any number over the 10,000 threshold tends to create a very strong reaction by the home community in terms of long-term demands of belonging and attribution of citizenship. So, to end, only political refugees need to apply. This was the case definitely for the Czech and Slovak experiences, and what we see is eventually we see across the Visegrad region fortification of citizenship and making it a very, very difficult and rarely accessible commodity for people who cannot act on the jus sanguinis and or state amnesties for returning, in the case of Hungarian and Czech and Slovak refugees, and or people who were accepted en masse, like the Greek refugees, to the Czech and Slovak republics under a state amnesty. Resettlements. The tendency for the Visegrad nation states is to resettle groups to where they supposedly belong. So in the case of Jews, they were sent to Israel. In the case of Germans, they were sent to what became the current day Germany. In the case of Russians, some of them naturalized, others were meant to go back. So the idea is never to include them formally for the long term, but to provide a sanctuary, which, to the chagrin of many of my colleagues, I think makes sense to me. Because if you have such a small polity, and if you've been basically on the transit route of hundreds of thousands of people applying for asylum and refugeehood and ultimately aiming for citizenship, you do not necessarily have the capacity to expand the Marshallian paradigm of give more and more and more citizenship. But there's also the EU consortium. EU is not necessarily open to citizenship arrangements. It relies on, however, temporary labor negotiations and or, how shall we say, using the human capital but not necessarily through membership to the polity. So this is the EU history, and then that history is being repeated in the Visegrad socio-political landscape, and then for very understandable reasons. However, it doesn't mean that you can basically curtail your duty of care and your obligations for sanctuary provisions. And I think that's where the problem becomes very observable in the event of the most contemporary wave of refugees who are not Europeans. The fact that there is a confusion about whether they'd like to become citizens, and then they're definitely not Slavs, they're not part of the European community, and therefore they should not even be given asylum or temporary protection. That's where the confusion seems to be really thwarting histories of care that mark the I would say societal and political histories of the Visegrad landscape. This is a painting that actually sits at York University. This is a large-scale painting by myself. The irony is these are people on the move, but they root. And then they're made of stone and they can't move. So that's the tension, right? So the space-time of post-socialist Central and Eastern Europe, more specifically in my work, the Visegrad platform set up in the 1990s to facilitate entry of three-side states into European Union and indicate a major change in refugee reception policies and citizenship rules. These rules basically delegitimize others' rights in terms of their Europeanness, their Slavicness, and their political added value. And the Visegrad policy eventually became a Fortress Europe, a policy and its extension. So that's where I'm going to end. And as I said, this is ongoing work, and I'm very happy if you can add to my questions and challenge some of my presumptions. Thank you.
Dear Nergis, thank you very much. This was really very, very interesting, I bet, for different types of scholars, political science, history, law, and so on. So I'm just checking if we have any questions online. Online, there are no questions. Now, I would like to ask you if you could perhaps, and I know there's a high possibility that you can, because you have also been dealing with the broader, let's say, global South, for example, as well, Middle East and so on. If perhaps you could just extrapolate this the aspect of what you presented here regarding the fortification of citizenship in this our let's say narrower regional East to other solutions in other regions, for example the Middle East. We know that there is a lot of people who have been raised generations and generations in refugee camps, and I'm also very interested in other approaches to citizenship as opposed to just plain fortification by different means.
Right. Shall I answer now?
If you wish.
Okay, so last year was an odd year for me because I had to spend extended periods of time in Lebanon looking at their reception of Syrians. They accepted a very large number, close to 1.5. Turkey accepted 5 million Syrians, an additional 1 million Iraqis, Iranians, Afghanistan, or people of Afghani origin, and Jordan, which basically accepted about 2 million. And so the Turkish practices might be more familiar to you because Turkey also went into agreements with Germany and EU in terms of keeping the arrivals within Turkish borders and then not allowing them to cross the Mediterranean or the Aegean. And that became a major infrastructural investment with the understanding that the majority of these 5 to 6 million people do not have citizenship, but they are under temporary protection regime. So it's very similar. What's different, perhaps, is that Turkey is becoming a hinterland economy, and these people are directly integrated into the labor market. And then there are 3 main sectors that they're actually employed, and they're employed par standard and contractual, which we call precarious status. So one is agriculture. They do the majority of the harvesting and animal husbandry. The other is service sector, tourism, cleaning, marginal sectors, and the third one is mining. So we see an increasing number of these refugee communities basically working with permit or without permit in those 3 very major industries in the Turkish landscape. So I'm not sure that's the solution, but that's part of the reason why Turkey is not pushing them back. It's actually integrating them into the labor economies. In the case of Lebanon, I think I was faced with an existential crisis of my academic life, because when I went in, I was exposed to Lebanese scholar colleagues who were arguing for extension of citizenship to Syrians and others in Lebanon, and very activist scholarship. And when I landed in Lebanon, I started interviews with human rights organizations, NGOs, lawyers. It became very clear that the majority of the Lebanese population had no interest of giving citizenship to the Syrians, not the least for the fact that they were under Syrian occupation for 15 years. And their country is a very small population of 4 million. We're talking about 1.5 million Syrians. They are really worried that this is actually an imposed strategic agenda by United States for the Greater Syria project. It's going to destabilize their borders. Suffice to say that they provide education, they provide healthcare, they provide identity cards, but the general discourse was in about 30 years' time they'll go back. Now, as I moved down to Jordan, again, I had the honor and pleasure of doing multiple interviews, including ministers in Jordan. Jordanian situation was very similar to the Turkish situation in the sense that there was enormous infrastructural investment to the Jordanian state so that they keep the Syrians and the Afghans and whatnot. And then there's also a sizable group of Iraqis from the Iraqi invasion of 2003. To this day, about 2 million. The majority of them are stateless. So they live on temporary permits in Jordan and Turkey and Lebanon. So Jordan basically engages in a 2-tier structure of belonging. So let me give you an example. For instance, all Syrians who are settled in Jordan right now are not only eligible for access to education, but they're almost forced by the state so that the children are educated to guarantee integration. And please understand, despite Jordanians, Syrians, and Lebanese all speak Arabic, they come from very different national cultures, and their status of living is fairly different. So the majority of the refugees who arrived in Jordan and Lebanon came from the rural hinterland. And Lebanon and Jordan are primarily urbanized countries. For instance, in Jordan, female literacy rates are about 87%, as opposed to the Syrian population coming in, where more than half of the girl children were being married under the age of 15. So there were like very distinct, stark, oppositional cultural elements, despite the fact that Arabic was their common language. So what the Jordanian state does is it created different sections or additional sections to their Ministry of Health to deal with Jordanian women and girls' problems, including underage pregnancies and forced marriages. They also made sure that the Jordan and the Syrian children attend school after Jordanian children finish their day. They don't want these two populations to mix because they claim, the Ministry of Education representatives told me, that the levels of education were so different it would have been to the detriment of the Jordanian population if they were actually plunked into, the Syrian children were plunked into the mainstream system. So they are employing what we call transitionary strategies for healthcare, for education, but the ghettoization problem nobody can get over, both in Lebanon and in Jordan and to a large degree in Turkey. These refugee populations live among themselves and they create enclaves where outside population is not allowed. Marriage with the outside population is shunned upon. And then that indicates, at least for the Jordanian authorities, their willingness to eventually return. And there is no discussion as yet of citizenship in Jordan either. So, long answer, short summary, very similar, with the main difference that you cannot do closed borders when 2 million people are at your gate, a bit like Ukrainians at the Polish border. So you open the border. Either you're going to kill these people or put your army, and Lebanon does not have a sizable army, neither does Jordan, by the way, or you open the border and take care of the problem afterwards. But the strategies are very similar, temporary protection. The main issue right now, and it's the same in Germany, these are young populations, meaning about 50% of them are under the age of 16. And if you don't provide education to the children, and if they start living amongst yourselves for 5 years or more, you're basically dealing with an illiterate, uneducated teenage population who cannot be integrated into society either under temporary protection regime or via citizenship. So that's why education seems to be a priority once you let the populations in. Does that answer?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in our audience? Maybe?
No.
Yes.
I have a question. Where does the border come in, border regime? And it's sure I will try to explain because we're dealing more with we're researching more borders than migrations. And I suppose here it's more about migrations than borders. But I think the most interesting thing is when you connect those issues. And it was interesting. How did you seem to connect different aspects and different topics in the history that we usually historians of Central Europe don't.
Yes,
So
I know.
connected different times, but we somehow I'm grateful you that you managed to connect it with the right concepts. And when operating Slovenia and post-independent Slovenia with Czechoslovakia or in 50s and 60s Hungary, because we usually when we try to do that, we just see the differences. We don't see those underlying strategies. They are maybe only to be seen from a bird point of view, and of course, then if you take the. But I was just thinking, what has happened when the borders is there any difference when the border is new or old? Somehow we are researching different layers, historical layers of borders, and since maybe it was also different in that you managed post-imperial transitions. You mentioned post-imperial transitions. Maybe it was also different, I don't know, in 20s and 30s in Czechoslovakia kind of case, that these borders were still new and they were trying to establish that. When I think border here is border on the ground line there with all the infrastructure. But what happens when the border is old? Does this have any influence? Maybe it's a general question. It's deliberately put in a way that it cannot be straightforward. So what do you think? Is that if the border is old with established infrastructure and ideological boundaries, is there any difference than this border is some kind of new border that was established a couple of years ago with different shifts of population going on? No,
I really appreciate this. I mean, I worked in India for a good decade, And their prima facie starting point is borders are porous and they're fictive. Because in the case of, post-independence India, of course, first there's India, then there's India-Pakistan, and there's India-Pakistan-Bangladesh, and then there's Kashmir, and then there's Sri Lankan affairs. And so for them, borders are basically almost like distinct communities. They're not aligned, they're not established, but they're always porous, they're always changing, they're always leftovers. Which cannot be accommodated by this side or the other. So that's the subaltern or Southeast Asian understanding of borders. And when you move to, and I must say I'm not the only comparativist. Laura Robson, who is a good colleague, American historical scholar who works on forced migration, engages in similar scales of comparison. So we kind of try to see forced migration movements or expulsion of populations across landscapes and establish some commonalities as to why states and societies engage with these. So in that sense, I would say that post-imperial borders, by definition, everywhere create excess populations and require arranged or forced de facto population exchanges. Because the nation-state model, as it has been inherited, is not a federal model for the most part. It's a unitary state model, and it's majoritarian. So the imperial domain will always have mixed populations. The imperial domain will always have a bit of this, bit of that, as per the history of imperial constructions, right? So when you shrink it into neatly, precisely delineated borders, you're going to have all these other people who don't necessarily belong to the core population. But if I understood your question correctly, the post-independence borders is a different deal in the sense that they should not necessitate that degree of expulsions. So a post-independence Slovenia, for instance, I think, at least this is what I'm saying, the major problem was with the erased. They didn't quite know what to do with the erased because it belonged to a federal structure and these people have different backgrounds, and that seems to be the one that ailed them most. But they don't necessarily have a problem with the Italian minorities or the Hungarian minorities because they were historically already incorporated. Am I right in my understanding?
In a way, but the problem with the rape is also due to the legal legacy. Because in the Yugoslavia there were various legal statuses.
Right.
One of the status, of course, was republican citizenship. Every republic had its citizenship. But this citizenship was not even known by the people. It was not even important in Yugoslavia.
Right.
It was some kind of legal teacher that was there, and it was not important. But then it became important when the things have changed.
Right.
So it was something that people didn't even know it existed. There were people who were born Slovenian, ethnic Slovenian, born in Sarajevo, and they had problems with that because they didn't even know that they didn't have the right citizenship. They were notified, of course, and usually
they moved back. That's what I'm reading. Like they
or they were moved back. There's various stories, but those legal nuances were very important by this. And then, the second, it was connected on a political level, on a logical level, with this kind of, it's the race, they were against independence and so on. But,
because they were they were voting by the Union of Yugoslavia.
They were offered citizenship, they didn't want to have citizenship.
Okay.
That. And it's deliberately so because it's not about citizenship, it's about permanent residence. They were not notified that they will. It's not the issue so much of citizenship, but permanent residence. Those people who had citizenship of Slovenia were also didn't have citizenship of Slovenia, were offered
permanent residence
extension of the citizenship. Maybe I was not clear, but in this nuance, this was also was the legal problem, which was not so clear. But
So how did it come to the point that the Constitutional Court almost apologized for the practice?
because it was deliberate, it was they took the rights. The right of permanence. They were not notified. They didn't have any legal reason for doing that. They just said if you're not applying, you will get a citizenship. But if you do not by this date, you will lose everything. You lost everything. So they didn't even notify that they will lose everything. They just notified that they can apply for Slovenian citizenship.
So they lived here?
It was really by any legal standard. This was wrong.
Yes, I understand. Okay. But they didn't leave the country. Did they leave?
They didn't leave the country, but
because they don't have passports. How could they leave, right?
they didn't leave the country, but at the same time they were they dealt with them like they were leaving the country. Why did you leave the country? Oh.
Right. Yeah. No, I understand.
So you're a stranger now. I cut your personal ID card. You're a stranger.
Well, Burma, Malay, they did that with the Rohingya population, right? The Rohingya population were originally citizens, and that's the goodness of being a comparativist, because states, unfortunately, act in very similar ways, especially when they're violating rights. So the Rohingya were citizens, which many of us don't know. And then there was a change in the Citizenship Act, and their citizenship was revoked, and they became aliens in their own land.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
Yes.
and then the resources that their region was basically situated upon became valuable, so the army pushed them out of the border. And they could not come back because they didn't, quote-unquote, have citizenship or passports, so the Rohingya is the largest stateless population right now. But very similar, except in this case, the erased remained in Slovenia, as I understand.
Of course, remained in Slovenia.
Right.
It was different because they remained. They had citizenship of Yugoslavia because it was unique citizenship.
Yes.
But apart from that, they had citizenship of the republic.
First, you were the citizens of your republic.
Yeah, I was mentioning that.
Through
this
citizenship,
citizenship,
you were the Yugoslav citizen. And in 1991, it is exactly that was important. Those people were not without citizenship, but citizenships were republic citizenships. Yugoslavia stopped to exist anymore, and all of them were automatically transformed to other citizenship of the former Yugoslav republics. That is not true that they did not have citizenship. They had it. Yes.
Because they had citizenship of other republics.
Rightly, the basic problem was permanent residence.
And the fact that the citizenship of the Republican was not, of the republics was not something that was important in Yugoslavia.
It was not, but even legally at that time it was possible to apply for the citizenship if you were, I don't know, living in Belgrade, you had all the right to apply for the Croatian or for the, and it was more or less similar procedure as it was in 1991.
I'm going to ask you a question, but you don't need to answer me now. Hopefully you're going to be in the institute and I can talk to you separately. What happened to people who are of mixed marriage? So, one parent had Slovenian citizenship, the other had Republican citizenship. What's the status of these children? I believe
It was dependent on what kind of citizen the children had.
But that's a much bigger debate which we can talk independently. Yeah.
It depends on Slovenia, and then it was not a problem.
Oh, even one parent, father or mother, doesn't matter. Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. But what if you were born to parents who did not have Slovenian citizenship? If you were born here, so the people, the children of the erased. But if they don't have citizenship, as in the case of the erased, then what happens
You
to?
were listed as having citizenship of your parents, or the citizenship of the republic. So
But the republic is
Your
defunct.
parents had a pre-republican Bosnian citizenship. Then the children who was born was listed. He has also the republic.
And so they would have a
Bosnian.
question about the permanent residency again. The children would face the same problem. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I don't mean to take too much of time, but this is really important for me.
Yes, because sometimes
Yeah.
even legal can get misused.
It's
Yeah.
complicated and it's very
It's-
unique situation.
And also these cases are it's very good to check the individual cases as well,
Right,
because some
right.
children were erased whereas their parents were not, and then sometimes the father would be erased and the
This is
children
exactly what I'm
get,
asking. Yeah.
the document. But also this is very important what they said, that it was
Yeah.
mainly tied to, not mainly, but it was definitely tied to the residency permit.
Right.
And this opens up a lot of other questions that I would also like to ask you about rogue attempts of sorting statuses of people. We know from history the example of the Nansen passport, then there is like especially personal examples that I know people buy passports if they have to. People can also buy citizenship. People can also deliberately dispose of passports. Croatian police was also destroying people's passports when they were crossing the border.
Croatian police was destroying them.
Yeah, they would take passports of people.
Why?
Because this could be also a conversation for later.
Okay, I'm learning a lot. But we have a question from the floor. We should open these topics later. Now, Okay.
Other
I
question?
thought about this question in response to Marco's comment about the age of borders. And I was wondering about the difference between the creation of a new border and an old border receiving a new status. When you think about the partition of Hungary after the First World War, there's a new Hungarian-Slovak border.
Yes.
Someone drew a line on a map and suddenly there was a new line. Whereas when Yugoslavia collapsed, there were already the Republic borders with it.
Yes.
Let's leave Bosnia out of it. So the border of Macedonia,
Yep.
the border of Slovenia already existed. But what was once an administrative border with no real consequence became an important border.
Yeah.
So is that a different situation if there's a new border versus an old border acquiring a new meaning?
I think so. I really do think so. Except from some of these complicated situations of in a federal unit or an imperial unit, you would have the generic citizenship and you end up being in one of the subunits, and then there's a problem about where do you belong to, especially the larger unit becomes defunct, right? But by and large, the belonging issues would have been sorted out. And then the example for Slovenia is the Italians and Hungarians who were already there, and then the only exception in this case, from what I understand, and I really rely on a work of historian colleagues as well as anthropologist colleagues, is the Roma population, because they keep moving, and by definition they do not have citizenship.
I've seen some work on the Slovak Roma who were in the Czech Republic when
Yes.
the state collapsed.
Yes,
So the Slovaks don't want them to know your Czechs now.
I know, but the Czechs
don't
don't.
want them to know your Slovaks now.
Yeah, so they go to Paris, and then the French don't want them, and so the Roma population is almost like a litmus test for limits of citizenship, right? But if you bracket the Roma population, rest of the minority populations have been primarily sorted out by and large. The only exception might be with the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, you've got the emergence of the Macedonian Republic, which the Greek are not so happy about. Even the naming of it is a problem. So,
But that's all solved now. It's not Macedonia.
yeah, exactly. But at the initial phases, there were those kinds of brethren state issues about these borders. But I think it's quite different than, as I understand, what you traditionally work on, which is like the post-imperial borders, the new borders, which is a total recipe for human disasters and suffering and reshuffling, and many of them end up being resolved by death and disappearance and nothing else. So, and that's why I was taking some tours at the weekend. I like listening to local guides explain the history, and the guides were saying, well, we are the only country in Europe with a national anthem that actually glorifies peace and not war. Apparently, even in your national anthem, you sing of peace and then not war. And I think you're an anomaly, because I don't know any other nation state in Europe that does not owe its foundation to a war of some kind, and then kind of fixating it in a constitution. So if that is indeed the case, that Slovenia has historically been basically maintained through peace, that's a very unique feature. But yeah, that's why all national anthems about the blood being sucked into the soil, and then the martyrs, and then the remembrance, and most of them are very angry. They're not peaceful anthems. That's the answer to your border story. Post-imperial borders are sanctified by national anthems, none of which are necessarily peaceful. So
I think this is a powerful conclusion. So if you all agree, there's the smell of coffee over there, and everybody is invited to continue
And the
this
smell of coffee is
conversation.
borderless, but it doesn't go to the computer.
oh, you want me to stay here and not drink it?
No, you will join us now, and we will discuss further, because we also have a lot of other questions.
Thank you. I really appreciate this, and thank you for having
Yeah.
me. This is a great opportunity. Yeah.
Thank you for all of our listeners on Zoom as well, our tech support team, everyone who was here present. And I would like to invite also everybody for the History on the Edge Festival on the 23rd of May. We will be here, and there will be a lot of events, presentations, and good lectures. So thank you very much. Nergis, thank you.
Thank you.